cul-de-sac, dead end, closed, no through road or court is a street with only one inlet outlet. While historically built for other reasons, one of its modern uses is to calm vehicle traffic. History: cul-de-sac have appeared in plans of towns and cities before the automotive 20th century, particularly in Arab and Moorish towns. The earliest example of cul-de-sac streets was unearthed in the El Ain workers' village in Egypt, which was built circa 1885 BCE. The village is laid out with straight streets that intersect at right angles. Akin to a grid, but irregular. The western part of the excavated village, where the workers lived, shows 15 narrow and short dead-end streets laid out perpendicularly on either side of a wider, straight street. All terminate at the enclosing walls. Dead-end streets appeared also during the classical period of Athens and Rome. The 15th-century architect and planner Leon Battista Alberti implies in his writings that dead-end streets may have been used intentionally in antiquity for defense purposes. He writes, the ancients in all towns were for having some intricate ways and turn against streets, i.e. dead ends or loops, without any passage through them, that if an enemy comes into them, he may be at a loss, and be in confusion and suspense. Or if he pushes on daringly, may be easily destroyed. The same opinion is expressed by an earlier thinker, Aristotle, when he criticized the Hippodamian grid. He writes, but for security in war, the arrangement is more useful if it is planned in the opposite manner, as it used to be in ancient times. For that arrangement is difficult for foreign troops to enter and find their way about when attacking in the UK, their prior existence is implied by an 1875 law which banned their use in new developments. Inferential evidence of their earlier use can also be drawn from the text of a German architect, Rudolf Eberstadt, that explains their purpose and utility. We have, in our medieval towns, showing very commendable methods of cutting up the land. I ought to mention here that to keep traffic out of residential streets is necessary not only in the general interest of the population, but, above all, for the sake of the children, whose health is mainly dependent on the opportunity of moving about in close connection with their dwelling places, without the danger of being run over. In the earlier periods, traffic was excluded from residential streets simply by gates or by employing the cul-de-sac. It was in the UK that the cul-de-sac street type was first legislated into use, with the Hampstead Garden Suburb Act 1906. The proponents of the Act, Raymond Unwin and Barry Parker, thus gained permission to introduce cul-de-sac in their subsequent site plans, and they promoted it as a suitable street type for garden suburbs. Unwin's applications of the cul-de-sac and the related crescent always included pedestrian paths independent of the road network. This design feature reflects the predominance of pedestrian movement for local trips at the turn of the 20th century, and presages the current planning priority for increased pedestrian accessibility. The 1906 Act defined the nature of the cul-de-sac as a non-through road and restricted its length to 500 feet. Garden cities in the UK that followed Hampstead, such as Welwyn Garden City, all included cul-de-sac. In the 1920s, the Garden City movement gained ground in the US and, with it, came its design elements, such as the cul-de-sac. Clarence Stein, a main proponent of the movement, incorporated it in the Radburn, NJ subdivision, which was to become a model for subsequent neighborhood developments. The U.S. Federal Housing Authority recommended and promoted their use through their 1936 guidelines and the power of lending development funds. In Canada, a variation of Stein unregistered trademark S. Radburn 1929 plan that used crescents instead of cul-de-sac was built in 1947 in Manitoba, Wildwood Park, Winnipeg, designed by Hubert Bird. In 1954, the Central Mortgage and Housing Corporation published its own guidelines in which the cul-de-sac was strongly recommended for local streets and, as the FHA in the U.S., used its lending power to see its inclusion in development plans. The Varsity Village and Braeside, subdivisions in Calgary, Alberta also used the Radburn model in the late 1960s. In the 1960s the cul-de-sac attained systematic international application in planned new cities such as Doxiadisa unregistered trademark Islamabad. In the UK, new towns such as Harlow by Sir Frederick Gibberd and Milton Keynes incorporated cul-de-sac and crescents in their layouts. Planning theorists also advocated the use of cul-de-sac and crescents, most notably Christopher Alexander, in his Euro-OEA pattern language EO 1977 Euros book. Doxiadis also argued their important role in separating man from machine. Unplanned cul-de-sac. Virtual, unplanned cul-de-sac have appeared in the centers of cities which are laid on a grid. Whole neighborhood street reconfigurations emerged in several cities including Berkeley, California, Seattle, Washington and Vancouver, British Columbia. This transformation of the grid plan since the 1970s responds to the following needs: to limit access to an existing road newly designated as a major artery, enabling traffic to move smoothly on it, to protect neighborhood residents, particularly children, from the dangers of the traffic, to alleviate residents' concerns. This selective, sporadic transformation continues into the 21st century. As traffic volumes increase and as cities decide to remove or reduce traffic on specific streets of central areas, streets are closed off using bollards or landscaping, thus creating new, unplanned cul-de-sac streets and producing a new, functional blend of the inherited grid with newer street types. A recent variation of limiting traffic is the managed closure by using retractable bollards which are activated by designated cardholders only. However, not only do they stop cars, they also stop ambulances and other emergency vehicles and often lack adequate turning. Function. In urban planning, cul-de-sac are created to limit through traffic in residential areas. While some cul-de-sac streets provide no possible passage except in and out of their road entry, others allow cyclists, pedestrians or other non-automotive traffic to pass through connecting easements or paths. This design improvement, which selectively excludes one mode of transport while permitting others, can be viewed as an example of a Euro-filtered permeability Euro. Its application retains the cul-de-sac Euro unregistered trademark as primary function as a non-through road, but establishes complete pedestrian and bicycle network connectivity. In traffic engineering parlance, the cul-de-sac defines the local street as having primarily an access function rather than as one having a transport or through function. Suburban use and benefits. Since the end of World War II, new subdivisions in the United States and Canada, as well as new towns in England and other countries, have made extensive use of the cul-de-sac and crescent street types. Typically, there is one or several central roads in the subdivision with many cul-de-sac streets of varying length, branching out from the main roads, to fill the land in the subdivision. A dendrite or hierarchical pattern. Since the 1960s, this pattern has been the dominant road network structure of suburbs and exurbs in the United States, Canada, and Australia. It is also increasingly popular in Latin America, Western Europe, and China. In this pattern, there are only a few roads leading out of the subdivision and into other subdivisions or onto major roads. In the U.S., these changes can be attributed to real estate developers' desire to meet FHA guidelines and make federal home loans available to their consumers. In Canada, a similar incentive was provided to developers by CMHC. These incentives, which were discontinued in the 1970s, gave the initial impetus for the application of the hierarchical pattern. In other countries such incentives do not exist and its adoption is motivated by consumer preferences. American urban planning, in the 19th and early 20th century, emphasized a grid plan, partly out of extensive reliance on foot, horse and street cars for transportation. In such earlier urban development, alleys were included to allow for deliveries of soiled supplies, such as coal, to the rear of houses which are now heated by electricity, piped natural gas or oil. The use of cul-de-sac reduces the amount of car traffic on residential streets within the subdivision, thus reducing noise, air pollution and the probability of accidents. Ben Joseph and Lovigrove Syed indicate a substantially lower collision rate for street networks based on the cul-de-sac street type. Dunbar and Ray suggest that land use patterns play a significant role in traffic safety and should be considered in conjunction with the network pattern. While all intersection types in general increase the incidence of fatal crashes, four-way intersections, which rarely occur in a network with cul-de-sac or loop streets, increase total and injurious crashes significantly. The study recommends hybrid street networks with dense concentrations of T-intersections and concludes that a return to the 19th-century gridiron is undesirable. This decrease in traffic, in turn, is thought to lower the incidence of crime and increase desirability, because in most cases the people who traverse the cul-de-sac either live there or are guests of those who do. CPTED planning principles suggest increased natural surveillance and sense of ownership as a means of fostering security in a neighborhood. Both of these phenomena occur naturally on a cul-de-sac street, as does social networking. Design guidelines based on the CPTED perspective recommend its use for these reasons. Cul-de-sac streets increase spontaneous outdoor activity by children. A study in California examined the amount of child play that occurred on the streets of neighborhoods with different characteristics. Grid pattern and cul-de-sac. The findings indicate that cul-de-sac showed substantial increase in play activity than the open grid street pattern. Cul-de-sac reduce perceived danger from traffic, thereby encouraging more outdoor play. Similar studies in Europe and Australia found that children unregistered trademark as outdoor play is significantly reduced on through roads where traffic is, or perceived by parents to be, a risk. In addition, they confirmed the results of the seminal Donald Appleyard 1982 study, which showed the negative correlation between amount of traffic and social networks. This inverse correlation between amounts of traffic and sociability of streets was reconfirmed by a newer study that repeated Appleyard unregistered trademark South San Francisco analysis in Bristol, UK. It showed that the cul-de-sac street with the lowest traffic of the three streets had the highest level of social interaction. These studies recommend the use of the cul-de-sac or strong traffic calming measures. When cul-de-sac are interconnected with foot and bike paths, as for example in Vauban, Freiburg, Village Homes, Davis, California, they can increase active modes of mobility among their residents. Real estate developers prefer cul-de-sac because they allow builders to fit more houses into oddly shaped tracts of land and facilitate building to the edges of rivers and property lines. They also choose these discontinuous network patterns of cul-de-sac and loop streets because of the often significant economies in infrastructure costs compared to the grid plan. From an environmental perspective, cul-de-sac allow greater flexibility than the common grid in adapting to the natural grades of a site and to its ecologically sensitive features, such as streams, creeks and mature forest growth. The desirability of the cul-de-sac street type among homebuyers is implied by the evidence that they often pay up to a 20% premium for a home on such a street, according to one study. This could be because there is considerably less passing traffic, resulting in less noise and reduced actual or perceived risk, increasing the sense of tranquility. A survey of residents on three types of streets, cul-de-sac, loop, and through, recorded their preferences among these types. It found that 82% of cul-de-sac residents preferred their own street type, 18% preferred a loop, and 0% the grid. Only 13% of grid street residents preferred their own type and 54% would choose a cul-de-sac to live on. Two other studies, reported in 1990 and 2009 respectively, confirmed this upward trend and determined the premium that cul-de-sac streets command. The first found a 29% premium over the streets in a grid. The second, focused on trails and green belts, found that other amenities including cul-de-sac streets add significantly to the home value. The positive feelings that a cul-de-sac street could evoke, that residents value, are expressed vividly by Alan Jacobs in describing a short, narrow, and densely built cul-de-sac in the Shadyside neighborhood of Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. You step into Roslyn Place and you are likely to sense, immediately, that you're in a place, a special place, a handsome place, a safe place, a welcoming place, a place where you might wish to live. Narrowness and enclosure and intimacy bring a feeling of safety to Roslyn Place. Stay on our street. Is all the kids have to know. Gated communities, steadily increasing worldwide, employ cul-de-sac and loop street networks because, having a dendrite structure, they reduce the number of through roads and, consequently, the corresponding number of entries and exits to be controlled. Criticisms and discussion. Cul-de-sac are criticized by urban designers like those of the Foundation for the Built Environment in the United Kingdom for encouraging car transport for even short distances, as more direct connections are precluded by the geometry, which necessitates long travel distances even to physically nearby locations. This increases fuel consumption and vehicle emissions and has negative effects on health by reducing walking and cycling rates. Related research in the United States by Richard Jackson has shown that people in car-based communities weigh on average 6 lb more than those in traditional towns. An extensive analysis of the research evidence by TRB, however, shows only an association between the built environment and physical activity levels, not causal connections. The evidence does not either identify with certainty which characteristics of the built environment are most closely associated with physical activity behavior. The study also warns against confusing inadequate physical activity with obesity, which is the outcome of an energy imbalance. Many contemporary lifestyle trends, some inevitable and some avoidable, contribute to this imbalance and must be considered in understanding and combating obesity. The impermeability deficiency of the typical cul-de-sac street can be addressed by applying a modified, improved version of it, mentioned above, that enables pedestrian and bicycle through movement. While this more permeable version can be applied in new developments easily, modifying existing impermeable cul-de-sac streets is problematic as it encounters property ownership issues. Efforts in this direction are, however, being made. Given the complicated legal process and the sheer number of exiting cul-de-sac streets, however, such efforts would be slow to produce results and may only have a marginal impact in changing the landscape of existing districts. Conversely, transforming existing streets that are part of a grid plan into permeable, linked cul-de-sac, as was done in Berkeley, California and Vancouver, British Columbia, is physically and administratively easy due to the public ownership of the street right-of-way. However, residents on adjacent through roads may resent the potential traffic increase and delay the process. In Berkeley, the barriers used were permeable to both pedestrian and bicycle traffic, and became the backbone of the bicycle boulevard system in that region. Increases in pedestrian and bicycle permeability may result in a displacement of local car trips for short-distance destinations and consequently a reduction in neighborhood vehicle emissions. The impermeable cul-de-sac not only discourages walking and biking but also increases the length of car trips by the circuitous geometry of the dendrite network structure of which it is a part. Research studies examine the influence of several variables on the amount of car travel that residents of several types of districts recorded. Results vary considerably among one another, but there is general agreement on a number of key correlations. A. The wealthier and the larger the family is, the more cars they own and the more they drive. B. The farther away a family lives from the city centre and the fewer the jobs in the vicinity plus a slow bus service, the more they drive. And C. Street patterns may add a 10% length to local trips, but the total VKTs are affected more by the macro-urban than the micro-neighborhood structure. Cul-de-sac, especially those that also cut off pedestrian connections instead of limiting only road traffic, have also been criticized for negative effects on safety, because they decrease the amount of through traffic that might spot an accident or crime victim in need of help. Proponents of cul-de-sac and gated communities have in turn countered that the reduction in through traffic makes any stranger much more recognizable in a closed local environment and thus reduces crime danger. This view has in turn been characterized as unrealistic. It is argued that since only a very small proportion of all non-locals passing through the area are potential criminals, increased traffic should increase rather than decrease safety. New research has expanded the discussion on this disputed issue. A recent study did extensive spatial analysis and correlated several building, site plan and social factors with crime frequencies and identified subtle nuances to the contrasting positions. The study looked at, among others, A. Dwelling types, B. Unit density, C. Movement on the street, D. Cul-de-sac or grids, and E. The permeability of a residential area. Among its conclusions are, respectively, that A. Flats are always safer than houses and the wealth of inhabitants matters. B. Density is generally beneficial but more so at ground level. C. Local movement is beneficial, larger-scale movement not so. D. Relative affluence in the number of neighbors has a greater effect than either being on a cul-de-sac or being on a through street. It also re-established that simple, linear cul-de-sac with good numbers of dwellings that are joined to through streets tend to be safe. As for permeability, it suggests that residential areas should be permeable enough to allow movement in all directions but no more. The over-provision of poorly used permeability is a crime hazard. More generally, the new urbanism movement has offered criticism of the cul-de-sac and crescent street types not intended to network with each other. It has been suggested that such street layouts can cause increased traffic on the collector streets. It is recognized that cul-de-sac and looped streets inherently remove car traffic through them and restrict access to residents only. Resident traffic is naturally channeled to minor residential collectors and to arterials that provide inter-neighborhood and inter-district connectivity. A study, reported in 1990, compared the traffic performance in a 700-acre development that was laid out using two approaches, one with and the other without hierarchy or cul-de-sac streets. It concluded that the non-hierarchical, traditional layout generally shows lower peak speed and shorter, more frequent intersection delays than the hierarchical pattern. The traditional pattern is not as friendly to the long trips as the hierarchical but friendlier to short trips. Local trips in it are shorter in distance but about equivalent in time with the hierarchical layout. A later similar comparative traffic study of about 830 acres concluded that all types of layouts perform adequately in most land use scenarios and that a refined hierarchical, dendrite network can improve traffic performance. Anecdotal and research evidence suggests that navigation in a disconnected network of cul-de-sac and looped streets is inconvenient and non-intuitive, particularly when combined with curvilinear geometry. Loss of orientation and sense of direction is also a common experience in older cities with cul-de-sac streets as well as in cities with highly irregular block geometries and sizes and corresponding street alignments that produce a labyrinthine effect. The long history of such cities implies that an irregular, complicated street network that appears entirely illegible to a visitor is well understood and used by the inhabitants. More convincing about its workability for their permanent residents are the case histories of cities such as Regensburg that show a gradual transformation of an imported or imposed orthogonal, a Euro-illegibly a Euro-grid to the traditional Euro-y confusing Euro street networks. Cul-de-sac and loop streets can reduce the size of any given neighborhood to a single street. Neighborhoods can be defined by geographic boundaries but more often it is shared ethnic, socio-economic and cultural characteristics that create social cohesion irrespective of apparent physical boundaries. Murphy et al., who propose a model for structuring an urban network, suggest that neighborhoods cannot be designed into being. A Euro-OE community. A Euro is viewed as a dynamic social and cultural construct especially in contemporary, open, multicultural cities. Residential area street configuration can only assist its emergence by reducing through traffic and increasing local pedestrian movement. A design goal for which connected cul-de-sac and looped streets are suited. Issues of pedestrian trip length and isolation are sharply evident in the back-to-front housing arrangement where the front of the house fronts onto the cul-de-sac street while the rear fronts onto the main roads. Some of these problems can be mitigated by the newer practice of connecting the neighboring roads and cul-de-sac with public pedestrian cycle paths. In effect, this removes the discontinuity aspect for these modes of transport. Built examples of such connected cul-de-sac can be found in the United States, England and Greece. Acknowledging their use, Germany, under the 2009 amendment to the Road Traffic Act, introduced an additional sign for cul-de-sac that are permeable to pedestrians and cyclists. A new system for organizing connected, permeable cul-de-sac into complete neighborhoods, the Fuse Grid, has been developed by Canada Mortgage and Housing Corporation. In the North American development context and planning literature, cul-de-sac streets have been associated with low-density residential development which is judged as inefficient by sustainable development theorists and proponents. The increased prevalence of cul-de-sac streets occurred in the 1960s and 1970s, a period of rapid economic and city expansion, when a detached house on a large lot meant an ideal form of habitation. overlooking the potential negative externalities. This temporal coincidence of the wide adoption of a street type and an increasing demand for large lots and houses creates the impression of a necessary relationship between street type and unit density. Historically, however, the earliest systematic application of the cul-de-sac street type by Raymond Unwin had a unit density between 8 and 12 units per acre, considerably higher than mid to late 20th century. Even early 21st century developments rarely achieved densities above 5 to 7 units per acre in the suburbs. Conversely, early 1950s suburban developments that were laid out on a grid exhibit similar low densities. Evidently, street, network type and density are not linked causally. Other factors, such as land scarcity and income influence the outcome as, for example, in cities that are landlocked or that have low average incomes. Another concern is often raised by emergency services, who can have difficulty locating streets when a community consists of a large number of similarly named cul-de-sac. Also, large fire response vehicles, in particular, can have great difficulty with turning around in a cul-de-sac. However, confusing street naming is not a necessary outcome of street network design and can be improved. The practice of naming orthogonal networks by numbers and letters in the corresponding cardinal directions has been criticized by Camilo Sitt as lacking imagination. Nonetheless, police and fire departments now use advanced GPS systems that quickly locate the destination and the shortest path to follow. School buses can also have a hard time turning around, which means that children who live in a cul-de-sac must often walk to a bus stop on a main through road. However, recent research on obesity and urban planning suggests that this may be an advantage because it enables children to get daily physical activity. Longer walking distances, however, reduces interest to use buses especially when a car is available. This disincentive to walking to the school bus stop can be overcome in planned cul-de-sac streets by regulating their maximum length to about 500 ft, as was recommended and practiced by Unwin and others. Weighing available evidence, has led a few U.S. cities including Austin, Texas, Charlotte, North Carolina, and Portland, Oregon to restrict and regulate the inclusion of cul-de-sac streets in new suburbs. However, a 2010 study on sprawl in NA by a legal expert concludes that A neighborhoods dominated by cul-de-sac are less walkable than those that include street grids. A unregistered trademark. On the other hand, cul-de-sac do have a countervailing public benefit. Because of their very inaccessibility, they tend to have less automobile traffic. Given the existence of important public policy goals on both sides, a city seeking to maximize walkability should not favor cul-de-sac over grids, but should also allow some cul-de-sac as a legitimate residential option. Unregistered trademark. In addition, there are a middle ground alternatives between prohibiting cul-de-sac and mandating them. For example, a city could encourage cul-de-sac combined with pedestrian walkways. This design combination is shown in the Village Homes layout and is an integral part of the fused grid. Terminology. George Orwell wrote in his 1946 article, Politics and the English Language, that the term cul-de-sac is another foreign word used in English as pretentious diction, and is unnecessary. The word cul-de-sac, and its variants, dead end, and no exit, have inspired metaphorical uses in literature and in culture, often with the result that a word or phrase seeming to have a negative connotation is replaced in street signs. Despite seeming to be a borrowed French phrase, the expression cul-de-sac originated in England during the period when French was spoken by the English aristocracy. In Catalan or in Occitan, cul-de-sac literally means bottom of a bag. J.R.R. Tolkien used the name bag end as a literal translation of cul-de-sac, to poke fun at the British use of French terms. In Canada, cul-de-sac is commonly used in speech but no exit, or no through road is more common in road signs, especially in Western Canada. In Quebec and Newfoundland, cul-de-sac is in far more common use, though Quebec is increasingly using impasse instead. In Australia, they are signposted as and often referred to as a no-through road. The term cul-de-sac generally only refers to a reasonably short street with a bulbous end, or even only to the end portion. A long road that is a no-through road and terminates abruptly is usually called a dead end. New Zealand. In New Zealand they are signposted as no exit, but are often not signposted at all. The terms cul-de-sac and dead end have the same senses as in Australia. United States, U.S. Federal Highway Administration rules state, the dead end sign may be used at the entrance of a single road or street that terminates in a dead end or cul-de-sac. The no outlet sign may be used at the entrance to a road or road network from which there is no other exit. There is no federal regulation on no exit. The phrase, no exit, is also preferred for Chicago signs, although dead end is still used there. New York City has favored dead end since at least the 1930s, when Sidney Kingsley used the phrase to title his Broadway play about poor, tough East Side youths with lives of little promise, in contrast to the dead-end streets of the nearby Sutton Place neighborhood. Kingsley's play was later made into a movie, Dead End, which proved so popular that it spawned similar movies, many starring a group of recurring characters known as the Dead End Kids. The play and movies created such a strong image of bleak futures and an unfair society that some municipalities changed the sign terminology for cul-de-sac, often to no outlet, or no exit. In New York City, as of 2008, there were 4,659 dead-end traffic signs, along with 160 no-outlet signs. The city records, which go back to the 1960s, show only a couple no-exit signs once existing near the approaches to the Midtown Tunnel, and which are no longer there. We hear that some towns use no outlet instead of dead end because they think it sounds less morbid, New York City Commissioner of Transportation Jeanette Sadiq-Khan said in 2008. We tell New Yorkers the truth, it's a dead end, and we think that motorists get the point quickly. California uses the phrase not a through street or not a through road to mark roads or road systems that end in cul-de-sacs. Other uses, in military parlance, a cul-de-sac refers to a situation where an army is hemmed in on all sides, but behind cul-de-sac is also used metaphorically to mean a line of thought or action that leads nowhere. In medicine, the expression is used to refer to the rectouterine pouch, also known as the pouch of Douglas, the deepest point of the female peritoneal cavity. Signage. See also, fuse grid, permeability, turnaround. References.